Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to talk about trees. How to use them, when to use them, and why you should use them. Miniature trees seem to be a real headache for model builders, and I can see why. Trees add color to your spread, but they tend to have a few major strikes against them, and this repeatedly confounds model builders. Despite this, trees are an indispensable element to our art. We need them to provide the right look and environment for many of our builds, and you just really can't get around this. Avoiding the pitfalls that come with using trees effectively and properly takes some consideration. Let's explore the critical elements of using trees for the art of building a miniature, so you can use them in the best possible way to enhance your work. The first problem with rendering trees in miniature is simply that they are very common. As I've mentioned in other videos, the theory behind models in miniatures relies a lot on the viewer's experience with the object they are viewing. The more familiar the viewer is with the subject, the more work you have to put in to fool the viewer's subconscious to accept that what it is looking at is something that belongs in reality. For some aspects of building a miniature, the bar is fairly low. This is a mind flayer from Dungeons & Dragons that I painted when I was about 12. Since nobody has actually seen a brain-eating tentacle monster in real life, I hope, the model builder does not have to go to the same efforts to convince the viewer's brain that this is in fact a real thing. This is because they have nothing analogous to this in real life to judge the subject against. But unless you've lived in the tundra for your whole life, anyone, and I mean anyone, will be 100% familiar with the concept of a tree. This sets the bar very high. Our subconscious knows exactly what a tree looks like, how big it is, what its textures are, and that makes it exceedingly hard to convince somebody that a model is in fact a tree when it's rendered in miniature. What's the solution to this? Unless somehow you can hypnotize your viewers to forget what a tree is, you'll be subtly combating the viewer's subconscious for as long as you're a miniature builder. What you can do, though, is manage the viewer's relationship with the wooded areas in your subject. For most dioramas, this would come in the form of putting as few trees in the subject as is realistic and makes sense. This way, you only have to go to massive lengths on one or two subjects to make them as realistic as possible. You don't really have to blow your budget or time on photorealistic trees in huge number if you just focus on one or two. For larger model spreads, you want to push the trees to the back and put the subject in the foreground. You want the viewer to accept that the trees are just a backdrop and move the more interesting items into the front. Notice that most model train spreads put buildings and trains in the foreground and arrange the trees behind as a secondary focus. In this sense, our subconscious familiarity with trees works to our advantage. Everyone already knows about them, so whatever is up front and center in your spread, as long as it's more interesting, will draw the viewer's attention. Lastly, miniature gamers have an easy out. Because wargame models need to interact with their surroundings, trees are almost never a main focus on the table, so we can get away with a smaller number of them. Moreover, since miniature games require modularity, Trees are often grouped on specific bases that imply whole sections of woodland. So, as a model project, we have to only build one or two trees to indicate this. This brings us to choosing the model trees themselves. We've already established that how you use the trees in the spread will dictate where you want to place the most realistic or visually interesting ones. So now we come down to the practical considerations. Here we have to remember two important facts. First, trees occur in nature in a wide variety. Unless you're trying to create a miniature Christmas tree lot or logging tree farm, you'll want quite a wide number of types. Second, even with carefully planned projects, chances are you'll need a lot of them, which of course implies a big expense. To deal with these issues, I prepare 4 types of trees and mix them in various proportions on my terrain. I generally start by 3D printing some trees. There are a ton of files to do this. You can control the size and shape this way, and some of them are very detailed. From here, you can glue clump foliage or lichens to the top, or add green polyfiber and then stick flock to it with hairspray. My favorite, though, is to glue individual AK shrubbery stalks to the top with super glue to form branches. Because of the control and detail you can get with this method, I usually reserve 3D printed trees for the major positions in the dioramas I do. I feel they can be made the most convincing. 3D printing is also generally cheaper if you have access to a printer, and so that makes it a little better than buying pre-made trees. I make a large batch every couple months and just have them on hand. Next, I occasionally use a variety of tree armatures from manufacturers such as Woodland Scenics. These are largely the same as the 3D printed option, and after you bend them into shape, you can top them in exactly the same way. They of course need to be painted as well. The drawback here is cost. A bag of these runs a fair price, so I never rely on armatures alone. Instead, I mix them in freely with other types, and they tend to be my second line trees of choice after the 3D printed options. The third type of tree is purely for convenience and cost effectiveness. They're here to fill out my wooded areas. And this is simply some cheap model trees bought in bulk from Amazon or other online stores. These trees can be ordered in huge lots of 50 or more and come in various sizes and types. They also look really bad. Because of this, they always get a visit from my airbrush to refinish the trunks in browns or grays, and I almost always dust several lighter tones of green or greeny yellows over the top to fix the crazy bright foliage. Despite this, though, the whole process doesn't take much time, and the pre-made and cost-effective nature of these trees makes them useful. If you want to put time into turning one of these into a centerpiece, you actually can if you can find one that's finished reasonably well. But you'll likely be better off getting more control on the subject by using 3D prints or armatures. The last type is the tree of the homemade variety. I use the bamboo skewer method for this. I've covered this in detail in another video, but essentially you split the skewer down the grain and spread out the individual fibers to form branches. You can then keep subdividing these until you have a reasonable tree. After this, you can coat the resultant Mod Podge or plaster to lend it strength, and then you can top it with lichens, clump foliage, or any other product for greenery. The advantage here, of course, is that this method is cheap. You can get hundreds of bamboo skewers for a couple of dollars and just go to town. Again, this means that I usually build them in batches. The drawback is that these aren't as durable, but when done properly, they'll still last. As an added benefit, the bamboo skewer method also makes really convincing deadfall. Most model trees come made to put bright green leaves on top, but the fact is fallen trees and branches are everywhere in wooded areas. Also, if you're like me and model a lot of war zone based terrain, you're gonna need lots of broken trees anyways. The skewer method really suits this if you omit the greenery or snap the trunks and scatter them on the ground. If you want a dying tree, coat the branches in glue and sprinkle some oregano on top to imply dying or sparse leaves. Just as trees can work against you because everybody is familiar with them, you can also use this to your advantage. Because everyone has an intuitive grasp on the physical properties of trees and what they do, you can use this to enhance your work. The ways you can do this are probably limitless, but the fundamental ways are by establishing scale and context, because your viewer will not necessarily be aware of the physical properties of what you are rendering in miniature. You should always provide some visual cues in your work to establish the dimensions of the subject. This often is referred to as reinforcing scale and has the added benefit of adding extra visual interest. Here is a Flying Fortress bomber I made from scratch a few years back. Now, chances are, most of my viewers know a thing or two about this plane and know that it's pretty big. Some of you can probably even recite the exact dimensions from memory. However, believe it or not, some people might not have a familiarity with military history or aviation. And so we need to assist their experience enjoying the model by adding some trees. Anyone will know that trees are pretty big. This crash bomber is bigger than the trees, so the crash bomber must be really big. Just as you can use this to your advantage, though, it can also work against you. This Elector Count of Sigmar on his horse is clearly much bigger than these trees around him. Either he and his mount are freakishly large, or something's just wrong here. Making sure the subject and its surroundings mesh in terms of scale is important to the casual viewer. If you don't do this, the artistic value of your work will be disrupted. Trees are also handy for building a context for your work. A short time ago, I entered a model building contest where the subject was to be set in the fall. The other details were up to me as an artist. I knew I wanted to do a World War II Eastern Front diorama. I had all the models I needed, but then I also required a way to establish that it was in fact autumn. Fortunately, I was going to include some trees, so changing the leaves to shades of orange and yellow fixed the issue. Once again, the humble tree comes to the rescue, helping me set up the right context for the diorama. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is your source for miniature, terrain building, and diorama content, and we can't do it without your support. We want to build a community to ensure that the wonderful art of building a miniature is accessible to everybody. To participate, please consider joining on Patreon. For $4 a month, our Patreon members benefit from 10% off at Joe Saunders Terrain in the Etsy store, 5% off paints and hobby supplies at Torchlight Games, free access to STL files, a mention in our credits, and early access to our videos. Please check it out and consider joining. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember to subscribe, press the bell button so you get immediate notification on our videos, and until next time, Remember to keep building life in miniature.